I think when you really get into the why, the how all day long, we can talk about the how. And, for people who are really into the engineering side of the house, like, it gets really nerdy and, for good and bad. But like, we can talk about the how all day long, but if we're talking about the how for the wrong why, then we're building something for no real value. Right. And so if you start with the why, I think that really like lends itself to stepping back, kind of like take a big picture view and be like, okay, well, why are we building this? And if it's, hey, this gets us one of 5 steps towards mission value, then it's like, okay, then we push and, we keep doing what we're doing. But I think once you start to get into these cycles, you kind of periodically take a step back and say, why are we doing this? Well, we needed to do it for this purpose. And the reason that I'm here today, the reason that I build the project that I build in open source is because like I took a step back and was like, well, what could we do here? I see this neat thing, OSCAL. What could I do with it? And it's a balance. You don't want to be the thorn in everyone's side that's like, oh no, we could do it differently and here's why. But I always think there's like meaningful ways to approach problem solving that takes into account like what are we trying to do and why. And the why never comes back to hand waving and just doing it to check a box. The why is always this supports getting something into the hands of the warfighter faster.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Paramify podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Scott. On today's show, we have the honor to talk to Brandt Keller, an open software engineer and an open source developer advocate, right? His background includes achievements both in the military and in the technology sectors. He's a former U.S. Marine and he's transitioned from field communications within the military and is now a software engineer extraordinaire, and he's focused a lot on cybersecurity. And for some reason, he also likes GRC, governance, risk and compliance. And we found each other because we both love the Open Security Controls Assessment language, OSCAL, by NIST. And so we're going to ask a lot of questions of why Brandt likes OSCAL. I know why I like it. Brandt, thanks so much for coming on the show.
No, thanks, Kenny. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so take us to the beginning, Brandt. How did you start your career that you're in today?
Yeah, I think it's, kind of still in the works, but, for a lot of things, I've listened to a variety of the Paramify podcasts now, and I thought that people have a great backgrounds to share, and it's super cool. Mine, I think I resonated with a couple people out of high school, and not ready for college. I needed something else to go and explore, and military had always been calling my name. And so Marine Corps had been a big piece of kind of that maturation of my story, and got to do a lot of great things. And it, kind of provided a really good foundation for, trying to figure out what is it that I want to do in life, and, what are the possibilities. After my first enlistment, kind of got the idea there's something else out there I wanted to do. College degree, yada, yada. That's kind of, just time you have to put in order to get the piece of paper. But outside of that, started software engineering, working for some small companies, working for some larger companies. And I'd say there's threads to pull in there that kind of start to understand like why am I, an open source developer in the GRC space as opposed to, all the different options there are out there. And I think it really probably something we'll talk about is it keeps coming back to pain, and pain as a like precursor or byproduct of like, there's more efficient ways to be doing things. There's more ways to share information. And, that's what, ultimately led me to seeing like, hey, I had to build something. I had to have it accredited. And the process of building the thing, super exciting. Like that's where we had so much fun in the early days of like, there's an idea here, let's build it. And then after that is when, my, I would say kind of my naivety was, what do you mean we have to now like stop and we have to get it like accredited? Like we have to sit down with people who are maybe more familiar with RMF and understand like how does what we built meet 853 controls or what other controls that we have to meet, right? And going through that process was something that I never wanted to do from scratch ever again. And I think that as we start to dive into deeper layers, like people could probably see why OSCAL has probably been a good push in the right direction for never starting from square one ever again.
A push in the right direction. I really love about your background, Brandt. What I'm getting is a lot of people are just waiting to find out what their calling is. And what I'm seeing is as you kind of get outside of yourself and the military is a very selfless thing. It's not there's not really any room for, any selfish behavior, right? It's you're giving, you're sacrificing your time and sometimes the ultimate sacrifice. And what happens there is you find a calling, right? And it could be very, insignificant. It's small in some ways, but for me, it's the same way, right? Once I finally stopped thinking, just waiting, it's the finding where you can be useful and finding joy in actually doing something. You just got to get up and go do stuff, right? And I really like this whole the patient aspect of how you did things. For me, I always felt like I was in a rush. I always felt like, I have to go into college now, and now I gotta go get a degree, and what career am I gonna do? Like bouncing all around. And when I finally settled on a career, I freaking hated it, right? Because of the experience that you did, and it was actually that changed everything for me, because I could focus on, well, here's pain, and we can do something about it, or we can complain about it and avoid it, and we don't really move anything forward. Anyways, that's really interesting. I like that. So I noticed in a few of your posts recently, you're talking a lot about GRC. And so you talk about this accreditation process. So you're building something awesome and you want it to be able to talk to a government network, right? Something that, has potentially really sensitive information, passing over those wires, right? Or through the air, right? Whatever it is. So talk a little bit about accreditation, the pain in that process. What is that like for people who don't understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pain one stems from the conversations that have to be had, and it's almost like you're like translating to each other at the end of the day, right? Like you have engineers that could be software, like they're working on their application. You could have platform engineers, and there's all these tiers of engineers who are building things, and that's great. At the end of the day, really all I want to enable is like, how do I get software into the hands of warfighters more expeditiously, but also like software updates. So when the warfighter says like, yes, it does this, but I need it to do this little thing much better. Like how fast can you deliver an update? And historically, that's not a quick process due to various like process gates. But like the real pain that I kind of like continue to come back to is there isn't a single entity that always has either all the context or two, all of the technical expertise. I sure don't. Like, I can build things, and when somebody comes to accredit them, right? And this could be like a security portion, InfoSec, some part of your organization that is trying to do it internally so that you're prepared to be like, audited, accredited, assessed, etc. But you're kind of performing a translation. They're like, hey, here's what the control says. It is encryption in traffic, like for your traffic between services pods. Like, okay, now that that's been translated to me, I'm going to translate the code back to them, and you keep playing this game, right? Back and forth, and it's painful. It takes lots of time, and if this is a process that has to replay itself every single time you want to get a new environment accredited or a new piece of technology, it just doesn't lend itself well to scaling. And that's, kind of where I continue to like try to place my focus. And so, there's a lot of pain there. And, I'd say like with that comes also like how accurate are the statements that you're making between that translation. Did something get lost in translation that, either A, doesn't accurately grab like the configuration of how things were built, or B, is it, kind of like glossed over and for lack of a better way of putting it, like that there was a hand wave, like, oh yes, I agree. And then they moved on. Right. At the end of the day, that really scares me for these like super mission critical systems. And I'm not saying that is the case with them, but if I ever had to put my signature on a system that says like, yes, it's secure and it'll never be, vulnerable, which I know is a very loaded statement. But if I ever had to put my signature on something like that, I would want evidence being the like factual evidence being the backing up of my signature, as opposed to like statements in an Excel file, right? Like I want evidence. I want the checks that were assessed. I want actual pieces of the system to be shown for like, yes, this was done properly. It wasn't misconfigured. And that it also wasn't misconfigured like the day after it was accredited, right? Because drift occurs, kind of shadow IT occurs. Like ultimately people want the mission to succeed and they will do what they need to make that happen. But when it comes to compliance, because it's a kind of periodic in nature, we have to get away from that as much as possible and make it continuous and make it easy to deliver software updates, as easy it is to like reaccredit or make sure things stay compliant.
Yeah, we haven't had very many conversations about field operations on this podcast, but that really does bring it home, because you do have potentially you put our men and women in harm's way, right? If there is a compromise of a critical system, so you want to take, it's not a big deal until it is, right? And so
absolutely,
it's really, really important that we understand, why are GRC processes so important. And so you talk a lot about the significance of the common data format. Talk about some of the challenges that people have in adopting the common data format of OSCAL in the first place, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a super fun one to explore, because I think I'll be having this conversation. I've had it a bunch, and I imagine that I'm going to continue to have it with a lot of people. But there's so many variables involved. If you go and talk to your Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, scale is such a big piece of that. How do you take a Fortune 100 company and tell them to migrate, or maybe not tell them, but suggest like, hey, this is in your favor if you do this. And we can, anybody can toss that as a chunk of like wisdom over the fence. But ultimately there are people on the other side of that of like, okay, yes, I agree. But executives need to understand why we're doing this at the end of the day in order to get buy off. And the amount of work still is not insignificant. And so I think in trying to answer part of your question, like there still are hurdles, and it's not a one and done. It's a continuous piece of the puzzle. But what it does, I think, is it casts a vote at the end of the day, right? Like if you start to figure out like, hey, all of this stuff is abstractly in all of these other formats. And yes, we can collect them all and provide them to whoever needs them. But it's so diverse. Everything is in a different like object or format. And, if you start to look at something like OSCAL as a way to like say, like let's put everything in a common format so that, at the end of the day, if somebody just wants a report of like an inventory of components, right? Like that should be something that's readily available that we could go and write a tool, in the next 10 minutes that could go and be like, okay, well, where are those located? They're here, and let's consume them and report on like when they were last modified or some other, anything you want, right? The world is kind of ours for trying to, make someone's life better at the end of the day. And so I think you start to cast a vote if you say, well, I could do this in, a text document, but instead I'm going to do it in an OSCAL, because then every single one of these that I do from then on is me collecting things that I'll be able to like reuse or, with automation, generate faster, easier, more accurately.
Right. Whenever you have a requirement, there's usually a big there's a big reason for that requirement, like in NIST 800-53. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We know how to prevent risk in cyber. It's just the problem is the translation, because the people who are developing systems and supporting them need to be able to understand what is it that's being asked of me. What do I need to evidence so that the people that are making the decisions from a risk management perspective, what is the evidence that they need to say that, hey, this requirement has been met, and then finally, what is the way that we're going to report on it? And so if you need to answer that question all the time, over and over and over and over again, it really, really slows things down. So the cool thing about OSCAL for us was that at least we can start to have that conversation around, this is how we will talk about that. What's being asked of me? What is the evidence? And how do I report on that? OSCAL having a standard allows us a lot of flexibility. So we can kind of adapt really quickly if it's an ISSO from a government agency that needs to understand what it is. Great. We can export SSP. We can export specific inventory, things like that. We can give updates on POAMs, things like that. And then also, on the commercial space, from bank audits, from GLBA, from SOC 2, whatever it is, we have a standard way to talk about these different things in the cyber world. And I feel like there's always these new regimes that pop up. And OSCAL was the first thing that I saw that, hey, this is we've been looking for this for a long time. Now we have a way to translate control language, open security controls assessment language. It's great, right?
Yeah, and I think like what you're getting at there is like the translation piece is like you've essentially established a source of truth at some point in time. Like, hey, here is my OSCAL for this component, right? It's one piece of my system. Here's the one component. And then like that is a single location for those who are, a cyber background, for instance, or a compliance background, GRC background. Like they can start to be like challenging the data, understanding what's happening there, and put their expertise into the same pool of data that also, an engineer could be saying like, oh yeah, like here's what we're doing, here's how we're doing it. And because everything's kind of like codified anymore, like, hey, can you take a look at this and make sure it makes sense? Do we agree? Do we disagree? And the translation happens in data, not in, one-off conversations, ad hoc conversations that don't get documented and ultimately make no progress on the problem we're trying to solve. And so there's a lot of possibility just to like make things more accurate.
Yeah. Yeah. In one of your new articles, I actually, I tried to like get access to it, but I couldn't see it like when I clicked on it. But I'm interested to hear what it is, right? So you talked about the basic fundamentals of accelerating GRC processes where applicable, and so you say how open source can incentivize the change we need to move organizations away from manual and tedious workflows that hinder security, right, towards progressive workflows that require data freedom, right? So talk to us a little bit about that, because I'm interested to hear that. I tried to like click on it and it like was broken, and so I didn't, for me, but I want to hear about it, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you under the bus there. But
no, you're good.
I like
that's a hobby project of mine, still work in progress. So
okay.
But yeah, like to really like start to dig into it. I think that like the translation piece will always come to bear, but like the open source nature of, kind of agreeing on where things exist, how they exist, how to map them, is less of a opinionation, and can be driven more by collective knowledge at a larger domain, right? If we establish something that was closed source and here's our way of doing it, then I get it. Like that you're still trying to meet objectives, business objectives, some other objectives at the end of the day. But I think that with for instance, with OSCAL being open source and also having NIST standing behind it, that'll go a long way, and then start to bear the question of how do we, meaningfully implement the specification. And so if we're talking about how to author specific artifacts, how do you perform assessments? How do you get to assessment results? There's a lot of wiring that has to occur, mostly in code, but in such a way that if you're documenting how you do something well in your projects that implement OSCAL, the biggest piece for me as I continue to do this in my projects is try to document it and then level the playing field for somebody to come and collaborate and be hey, here's my assumption. Is this correct? And allow somebody to come in and just read hey, I just read your documentation. I didn't even look at your code, but your documentation said this, and that's incorrect. And I personally, I make no claims to be a GRC expert or a cybersecurity expert, but I'm learning and consuming this knowledge. And if somebody wants to come in and be hey, that's not accurate. Actually, this wire needs to connect down here and in a different way, then I'd be awesome. I can fix that. I can do anything in the code, but what I don't have is expertise. And so I'm building that base of expertise to help me inform those workflows. And then otherwise, try to get out and talk to people about, how does their information exist? How does it communicate across systems? And then how to make it transient, right? And we could probably go off on a tangent, but GRC systems, I'd say historically have consumed, built, populated information in a variety of different ways. And so you kind of get locked in to your data existing in that format. And if you ever did want to move to a different format or a different platform, et cetera, it becomes a burden. And so it comes back to the enterprise problem. Moving away is so tough that we don't want to do it. But how do we make the common format just the way of doing things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you need excellent tools that, that the people that are responsible for actually implementing the controls, that they're able to use and update. Because you talk about collaboration here. One of the reasons, at least on, in the private sector, right? One of the reasons that GRC endeavors usually fail is because the GRC team is there to just, make sure that compliance stickers are being accumulated, to make sure that, sales are happening. Yes, I think everybody wants to do the right thing, but they're always under budget because they have this burden of managing thousands of pages of documentation. across the team, or even individuals that are responsible for doing everything. So they'll say like, hey, we're trying to get FedRAMP, right? Great. Yeah, let's hire somebody. And then the person will be really sad, and they'll be like, hey, how's it going? And they'll start talking and telling you things. They'll be like, okay, yeah, well, whatever. Let us know if you need anything. But they're really responsible for doing the whole entire document. And then when they say, hey, software person, or hey, HR person, I need to talk to you about how you do this background check, or I need software person, I need you to know how you're implementing FIPS mode. And the software person will be like, what do you mean? What's FIPS? What's FIPS mode? Why is that important, right? To like me building cool stuff. And so there's this translation, and eventually they get tired, right? And the collaboration is really hard. So again, it gets back to that thing we were talking about, right? Which is, if you're spinning around trying to translate what the requirements are, eventually like 80% of your job becomes this paper chase and like, is this right? Is this correct? And it slows things down, and ultimately it's soul sucking. So if you want to understand like, a career where there's a lot of innovation yet to happen, it's in GRC, man. And it's gonna be really important, I think, for the future of security in a big way. So anyways, I just like how you were touching on that collaboration piece. It's so hard if you don't have great tools to do that, because an engineer is going to be working in their environment. What tools are they using? Well, they're using GitHub, and they're using Linear, and they're using AWS, and they're using all these things, and they have their workflows. And then a GRC person says, hey, come log into this. I'm not going to throw any tools out there. Like, come log into this tool and do all this stuff. And they'll be like, what is this? I can't even log in. It's just a really bad tool. And like, what do you want me to say? Just friction, right? Friction all over the place.
Yeah. And like, if you have to like, I mean, like I can empathize with a lot of people who have to like go and get accredited for something new, and who are going to like do FedRAMP from square one, right? Like it's an endeavor. And for sake of like open source, like why are we not sharing information? And then like talking to the security piece, like who has expertise on the piece that meets the control, right? Like I would argue that it's not the person doing like the compliance and actually mapping like a control to the technology, but like somebody back who implemented the technology, who built the application, like they have the expertise. There is a translation and a kind of a collaboration that needs to occur. But what if you shifted that discussion all the way left, and you said, hey, let's say I'm the GRC person, I'm the compliance person, security, and we agree with this person of expertise that like, hey, you meet this control by doing this in your app. And like, awesome. Like, I get it. What if I codified that in your source code now with OSCAL, and in such a way that every time that you make a change, we just do a check. Hey, like, is this still correct? And the compliance information hopefully is just coming out. Yes, still satisfied. Yes, still satisfied. You can, one, inherit that all the way downstream, but then two, when somebody comes in and like makes a change, like, like, I don't know why this configuration is this way. I'm going to turn encryption off. We don't need it here right now. Like, they turn it off.
I can't log in anymore. Turn it off.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. I can log in now. Sweet.
It's fixed. Yeah, right. Like there should be something in the system that says, hey, real quick, like this is now non-compliant, and we put it in your pipelines. And now like the conversation is happening as like, why am I non-compliant? Instead of the security compliance person having to do that every single time there's a change. Like, hey, no, we've just codified the change. You go spend your time on what's most important. And we see this in vulnerabilities. We see this in SBOMs. We see this in all of the supply chain security space, where it's like, there's so much to do. Like, there's never enough time in the day to do it all. So what are you going to focus on? What's priority? And I think this provides a good way of like, hey, we've automated this piece. If something goes wrong, it's going to tell me. Otherwise, I'm going to go focus on other pieces and get to 100%.
Yeah, when you say you've automated this piece, and you mentioned the hot topic, right? Software bill of materials, right? SBOMs, right?
Yep.
Talk to our audience a little bit about how SBOMs might be able to help in certain scenarios. Like, let's say, for example, implementing FIPS mode or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be tough because it's going to be contingent upon like what do you have in place to respond? Who knows what they're looking for? It's an expertise problem as well.
Sure.
But I think like really going to come down to is like having some piece of data that is going to let you at least know that you have something to go and validate, right? Like, so I kind of see the software bill of materials being that we've collected all this data, do with it what you will. And that's kind of the state of SBOMs to date. But now we have the data. What's your policy for that? Right. And so like, all right, well, if I want to check for something like FIPS and I want to know like exactly what, SSL libraries, encryption libraries, et cetera, are at play here, then we have a way to establish a policy that can say, hey, we'll go review SBOMs, check for these things. And if any of one of them is out of date or using a vulnerable version, et cetera, then flag that in a pipeline, flag that in your platform, whatever it is that you have in place to like kind of remediate that and get it on the backlog, right? Like if it's, something super critical, your log4j, log4shell type problems, obviously that's a fire. But I really like to see compliance get to, GRC, I guess, automated governance as it would be more of a process of just like, hey, this is continuous. We've accepted that it's continuous. And so when something becomes non-compliant, just like when I've got a vulnerability or a bug that needs to be addressed, just gets put in the backlog and prioritized accordingly. That way it's something that we're always continuously working on rather than continuously fighting fires, which it can burn people out, can get people very uninterested on security, and
been there.
Very hard.
Try to run away with it. I tried to run away so many times, honestly. I just kept coming back to it. I was like, I guess, we'll help them with this. So what are some quick wins then that companies can make in terms of setting up their environments to get, SBOMs, right? Like what are some quick wins for setting that up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I won't make a claim to be kind of like an SBOM like expert. And so like I think the quick wins really would be like how are you organizing them? How are you storing them? How available are they to operate on? I think that's super important. And then from there, just kind of like, what are you going to do with them? Are you running them against policy for sake of checking for something? Are you running them against like a scanner for checking for vulnerabilities? How do you handle that? But there's a lot of different threads to pull out here. And so, I think it's going to be tough if it's regarding like vulnerabilities and sake of like scanning against like a environment that you have accredited. That changes the scenario. Then, an application that I build in my free time for open source, right?
Yep. Yeah. So talking about open source development, I mean, you're a big advocate for it as well. I mean, we're all benefactors, right, of the open source movement. And I think it's been a great time to be alive. And if you're in tech, right, it's just super exciting. How do you see standards like OSCAL evolving, in the cybersecurity landscape?
Yeah, I think this one's particularly fun. I think I see them evolving through use, particularly. Like, I really enjoy conversing feedback, essentially. Yeah, like, hey, like we've tried to do this in ways that humans expect to do it, right? Like the specification is amazing at what it does, but it doesn't account for like human workflows, right? And that's why like I would build a tool like I'm building now that is like, I'm going to consume this specification and then I'm going to like wrap it in a variety of different processes so that like it's more developer friendly or it's more cyber friendly. And I think when you start doing that, you start to come to the conclusion that, hey, there's things missing from the spec that, I need, right? And this is why, I love to talk to the OSCAL team is like, here's how I'm using this. I think we could both agree that there's a better way to build the spec to support this use case. But, right now I'm getting the job done and I'm reinforcing the need for the use case. And then at the same time, you could work with OSCAL. OSCAL has like the Define initiative, and you start working with them to like change the specification, evolve the specification to meet the needs of actual users.
Right. Yep. That's awesome. So we just need feedback. You need to use it, and I think it has critical traction now. I see it getting better and better. We are dependent on it, for sure. Right. So, what are the main takeaways that you hope? So you post a lot about it. What are some of the main takeaways that you hope readers gain, especially developers navigating the compliance automation ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the continuity of continuing to challenge like common wisdom and what's out there in meaningful ways, right? You can't just tell somebody like, hey, this isn't fun, so I'm not doing it, because that isn't how businesses work. But like you can say, hey, like, what's the intent of what we're trying to do here? Well, the intent is we're trying to like capture how a control maps to a technology. Okay. And this is very much like where I've been empowered by the company I work for to kind of just go and explore more of this space and say like, okay, what's the intent here? Well, intent here is accreditations. The intent here is a benchmark. The intent here is to do this. And how do we capture that in a reusable way so that if, 10 different environments are all doing the same thing, then we can reuse it. And all of the, full-time engineer hours that went into building that compliance document essentially just gets to be we continue to reuse it because we're using it in many different spots. You kind of get a lot of different eyes on how it was derived. And so there's times to challenge it. There's times to update it. And, a source of truth goes a long way. And so right now, like the way we have this in our pipelines is to, try to get feedback loops as short as possible so that developers can see like, hey, I made a change and now it's changing our compliance for these controls. Those haven't hit production yet. And so I can remediate them before those get consumed by production. And that's ultimately what we're shooting for. But that's still internal to my company. And so how do you push this further out? How could you have something that you take off the shelf every day for a library for building a UI or, for those who are deploying systems on Kubernetes, right? Like your service mesh, your logging stack. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like everyone's doing the same thing at the end of the day. Everyone needs a logging capability. Everyone needs a monitoring capability. And so it's like, could we push all of this compliance data out into the furthest source of truth location so that anybody can pull from it and be like, well, here's it. You're not inheriting anything. Like reciprocity is still a very touchy subject. But you have like tangible evidence that lets you like, hey, I don't have to do this from scratch. I have the expertise of the people who actually build the thing. And, this allows us to get from square one to square 10 in seconds, as opposed to square one to square two in, weeks or months. And so it expedites things.
At what point do you think, Brandt, at what point do you feel like these compliance check mechanisms become a threat vector that needs to be protected? And is that something that organizations should be concerned about?
I think, yeah, it's a really good question because it continues to, right? Like we have this conversation about open source. It's a constant battle of why, I think there's a lot of good evidence out there. Why is open source more secure than closed source? Because of one of visibility. There are, thousands, hundreds of thousands of eyes on source code for something that is very popular on the source code. And so trying to make a malicious change there or understand something as a potential threat vector is certainly a possibility because it's all the source code is known and somebody could go and find, a 0 day or something to that nature. But I think the piece of the puzzle that's interesting for like compliance is how and where you control like your compliance information, right? And so I want all of the reproducible and reusable evidence and control information to be something that hopefully exists out in the open source. But when I'm building an SSP or my assessment plan for my production environment, you start to cater things, right? And so I'm gonna reuse all of that goodness, and then I'm gonna layer on top more like like finely grained compliance information that maybe I've catered to. Maybe I make that open source, or maybe that's, hey, the way that we've implemented the system and how we do, identity and access management is not something that I am broadcasting out openly so that people know, how I'm implementing it.
Sure.
But I think there's a big 50-50 like balance here for, reusability, getting people off the ground fast, quick, but then also catering to your specific environment with the things that you use.
That makes a ton of sense. So I don't talk a lot about this with most of the veterans that come on the show, but I'd like to talk about it with you. How do you feel your experiences in the Marines have influenced your approach to technology, leadership, innovation, life in general?
Yeah. A lot of different ways, especially for each of those like different categories, right? Leadership goes a long way in a lot of different capacities. And so like, I know me as a person, having had that experience, it helped solidify like a lot of different paths for how to work with small teams, how to make, objectives successful in those small teams. Right.
Awesome.
And so if you're going to go like ask any of my leadership, right, like, I tend not to ask for permission to do things because it's like, hey, I believe this is in our best interest and we should just go and execute. And I think, small team leadership is something that, kind of drives me to this day from the Marine Corps.
I love
it. And so like there's bits and pieces like that. But something that kind of resounding because the company that I work for is, very much driven from a lot of like veteran perspectives, and the mission at the end of the day can be, is the utmost importance. And there's a number of use cases. We've all experienced pain with software delivery, with technology in various different settings. And, that is a driver. That's a motivation for me, right? Like I want the most capable piece of technology to be sitting on the front lines as opposed to, something that can't be updated or I would say can't be augmented with superior capabilities because of something like compliance theater, right? We're doing compliance to check a box, and it's hindering us from delivering enhanced capabilities. We're talking about compliance, but like, why are we doing? What's the intent here? And the intent here is like, I want to get this piece of technology from end to end as fast as possible.
100%. That's so awesome, Brandt. I love it. So, Brandt, do you have any advice for kids that are just starting their careers? And if they want to get into cyber or anything, it doesn't have to be cyber. What advice do you have when people ask you?
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely come from probably a different background than some of, those who have been on the podcast before. Obviously, there's been some neat personalities, but like me as a software engineer, is just to kind of approach problem solving in, kind of like a less of a, I'm gonna pull a ticket, I'm gonna build the thing, and then we're done, right? And it's more of like a why are we doing this? I think when you really get into the why, the how all day long, we can talk about the how, and for people who are really into the engineering side of the house, like it gets really nerdy, and for good and bad. But like we can talk about the how all day long, but if we're talking about the how for the wrong why, then we're building something for no real value, right? And so if you start with the why, I think that really like lends itself to stepping back, kind of like take a big picture view and be like, okay, well, why are we building this? And if it's, hey, this gets us one of 5 steps towards mission value, then it's like, okay, then we push and we keep doing what we're doing. But I think once you start to get into these cycles, you kind of periodically take a step back and say, why are we doing this? Well, we needed to do it for this purpose. And the reason that I'm here today, the reason that I build the project that I build in open source is because like I took a step back and was like, well, what could we do here? I see this neat thing, OSCAL. What could I do with it? And it's a balance. You don't want to be the thorn in everyone's side. That's like, oh no, we could do it differently, and here's why. But I always think there's like meaningful ways to approach problem solving that takes into account like what are we trying to do and why, and the why never comes back to hand waving and just doing it to check a box. The why is always this supports getting something into the hands of the warfighter faster.
Start with why.
Yeah.
Start with why, and with why it's always your why, what drives you. I love it, Brandt. Well, this has been really great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This is great.
Brandt Keller, everyone. Peace out, guys.